Title. The husband walked in on his two best friends doing his wife. One of them said, "Dude, join us. She's so wild she can handle 3 Johnsons." He silently left and returned with something terrible in his hand. The room fell silent. As he ordered, "Get up, guys. Now we're playing by my rules." When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics were shocked to see what had happened with friends. Let's start the story. Ethan's hand trembled as he twisted the doorknob. The house was dark except for the flickering candlelight spilling from the master bedroom. He had left work early, a surprise for his wife, Natalie. But as he stepped inside, the sounds hit him first. The breathless moans, the rhythmic creaking of the bed, the low, hushed voices of men he knew too well. His stomach twisted, a slow burn igniting in his chest. Each step forward felt like wading through wet concrete, every fiber of his being screaming for him to turn back. But he didn't. He had to see. And then, there it was, the image that would be seared into his mind forever. Natalie, his wife of 8 years, was sprawled across the bed, her body tangled with 2 others, James and Eric, his best friends, the people he trusted most in the world. Eric glanced up first, his face gleaming with sweat, lips curling into a shameless smirk. "Dude, join us," he panted. "She's so wild she can handle 3 Johnsons." James just chuckled, barely fazed by the intrusion. Natalie didn't even flinch. Something inside Ethan snapped. The air in the room turned suffocating, his heart hammering so violently it drowned out all sound. His face went blank, too calm. Without a word, he turned and walked out. James scoffed. Guess he couldn't handle the heat. But Ethan wasn't leaving. He was retrieving something. When he returned, his grip was tight around the cold, unyielding metal of an object that gleamed under the dim light. His voice was ice as he stepped back into the room. "Get up, guys. Now we're playing by my rules." For the first time that night, fear crept into their eyes. Ethan stood in the doorway, gripping the object in his hand, a crowbar heavy and unforgiving. The room fell silent. Seconds ago, James and Eric were grinning like idiots, basking in their betrayal. Now their naked bodies stiffened, their eyes darting between Ethan's clenched jaw and the steel weapon he held. Even Natalie, who had been breathless with pleasure, sat up abruptly, the color draining from her face. Ethan took a slow step forward. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about trust, about loyalty. James and Eric weren't just friends. They were brothers in everything but blood. They'd fought for each other, bled for each other. And now, they had ripped his heart out without a second thought. "Ethan, man, put that down," James said, his voice coated with forced calm. He held his hands up, chest still rising and falling from his exertions. "Look, I get it, you're pissed." Ethan's grip tightened. "Pissed?" he echoed, voice eerily low. "You think this is just about being pissed?" Natalie scrambled for the sheets, covering herself in a pathetic attempt at modesty. "Baby, don't." His glare cut through her like a blade. Not a word. Because of this moment, this ultimate betrayal, everything he thought he knew was a lie. Because of them, he was about to become someone he never thought he'd be. Then he moved. The crowbar swung, fast, brutal, crack. James let out a strangled cry as the metal collided with his ribs, sending him sprawling off the bed. Eric lunged to grab his clothes, but Ethan was faster. Another swing, this time at the nightstand. The lamp shattered, plunging the room into flickering darkness. Shadows danced across the walls as Eric scrambled backward, arms shielding his face. Natalie screamed, "Stop!" But Ethan didn't stop, because stopping meant mercy, and they didn't deserve that. Eric, now on his knees, coughed out, "Ethan, please! We were just—" "You were just what? Destroying my marriage? Humiliating me? Ripping apart everything I built?" His voice cracked, but his hands stayed steady. The room reeked of sweat, betrayal, and fear. Because of this moment, Ethan had a choice. Did he finish this, cross the line and leave them broken like they left him? Or did he walk away, knowing some wounds never heal? The sound of sirens pierced the night air. Someone had called for help. It was too late. The game had already begun. The sirens howled in the distance, growing louder. Ethan stood motionless, the crowbar still in his grip. James groaned on the floor, clutching his ribs, while Eric sat frozen against the headboard, sweat dripping down his temples. Natalie sobbed, her hands trembling as she tried to cover herself. But Ethan, he was unnervingly calm. Then he did something none of them expected. He laughed, a low, eerie chuckle that made the air in the room even heavier. He dropped the crowbar to the floor with a metallic thud and took a slow step back. "You know what's funny?" he said, his voice void of emotion. "I almost let this break me." James flinched as Ethan crouched next to him. "But I realized something just now," Ethan continued. "I never really lost." Eric's eyes darted toward the bedroom door, considering an escape. But Ethan caught the movement and smirked. "Don't bother. You're exactly where I want you." Then came the real twist. The sirens outside weren't for him. They were for Natalie. The paramedics burst into the house just as Natalie collapsed, her body convulsing violently on the bed. Her skin had turned a sickly shade of gray, her breath coming in ragged gasps. James, despite his pain, tried to reach for her. "What the hell is happening?" he choked out. Ethan leaned against the wall, watching her with cold detachment. "She always liked her wine," he mused, "but she never checked the bottle I left for her." Eric's face twisted in horror. You poisoned her?" Ethan shrugged. "Let's just say, I evened the score." James tried to push himself up, but his injured body refused. He could only watch as the paramedics frantically worked on Natalie. Ethan turned to Eric. "You should be careful too," he said, his voice dripping with something sinister. "She wasn't the only one who had a drink." Eric's stomach dropped. No, it couldn't be. His breath quickened. His fingers trembled as he wiped his mouth, as if he could erase whatever had already entered his system. "You're bluffing," he whispered. Ethan tilted his head, expression unreadable. "Am I?" A heavy silence fell over the room. And then, Eric started coughing. The sirens outside weren't just for Natalie anymore. The game had only just begun. The flashing red and blue lights painted the bedroom walls in pulses of color. The once burning heat of betrayal had given way to something colder, more controlled. Ethan stood still, watching, waiting. Natalie convulsed violently on the bed, her body fighting against whatever was inside her. A paramedic barked out orders, jabbing a syringe into her arm, while another checked her pulse, too slow, too weak. James had pulled himself into a corner, his face twisted in agony, not just from the blow Ethan had dealt, but from watching the woman he'd just betrayed him with dying before his eyes. Eric clutched his stomach, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Ethan." His voice was barely above a whisper. "What did you do?" Ethan exhaled, slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable. He looked down at his watch. Any moment now. A paramedic's voice cut through the tension. "We need to move, now." The stretcher rattled as they lifted Natalie onto it, strapping her down as she fought against invisible hands, dragging her toward the abyss. Ethan finally spoke, his voice eerily calm. "I told you, Eric." His eyes flicked to the other man's trembling hands. "You should be careful, too." Eric's breathing turned erratic. His pulse hammered against his neck. He shook his head. No, this wasn't happening. It had to be in his head. Had to be. James's wild eyes snapped to Ethan, You poisoned her?" Ethan smiled, not a grin, not a smirk, just a slow, knowing curl of his lips. The paramedics shoved past him, rushing Natalie toward the ambulance. As they did, Ethan leaned in close to James and Eric, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you we were playing by my rules." Then, without another word, he stepped aside, letting them process what had just happened. Was it poison? Or something worse? The answer hung in the air, thick with dread. As the sirens wailed into the night, one question remained. Had Ethan truly won? Or was the real game only beginning? The sirens faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. The house was eerily silent now, save for the shallow breathing of the two men still inside. Ethan stood near the broken nightstand, the crowbar at his feet. He watched as James struggled to sit up, his ribs bruised, his breath ragged. Eric still clutched his stomach, his face drained of color, fear dripping from every pore. "What?" Eric swallowed hard, his voice barely holding together. "What did you do to me?" Ethan tilted his head, considering him. "It's funny, isn't it?" He crouched down, his voice a whisper that slithered through the room. How quickly fear makes the mind crumble. Eric's hands shook. He didn't know if it was the wine, the adrenaline, or the power of suggestion. But something inside him was breaking. He could feel it. James, always the smoother talker of the two, tried to steady his voice. "Look, man, this is messed up. I get it, He sucked in a painful breath. "We betrayed you, but you don't have to do this." Ethan's expression didn't change. No anger, no remorse, just something unsettling. "Oh, but I do," he murmured. "You two didn't hesitate to destroy everything I had. You did it with a laugh, a damn joke." He exhaled, shaking his head. Eric coughed, his breathing uneven. His mind raced. Poison. It had to be poison. "I called an ambulance," James said, trying to reason, trying to survive. Ethan cut him off. "For Natalie, yes." He glanced toward the door, as if picturing the sirens vanishing down the street. Then he looked back at them. "Not for you." The words sent a chill through the air. Eric's pulse pounded. He had to be dying. The room blurred. His stomach twisted into knots. "You son of a Ethan held up a hand, silencing him. Then slowly, deliberately, he pulled something from his pocket and placed it on the floor between them. A small bottle. Clear liquid. Unopened. Untouched. Not poison. Nothing at all. Eric's breath caught. Number James stared at it, realization dawning like a slap to the face. "You..." He exhaled shakily. "You didn't..." Ethan let the moment stretch, watching as understanding shattered whatever dignity they had left. "You did this to yourselves," he said, standing up. "All I did was give you a reason to panic." Eric looked at his trembling hands. His mind had betrayed him. His own guilt, his own fear had sent him spiraling. And James? James had been waiting to die since the moment Ethan walked in. Ethan turned toward the door, his work done. He didn't need to lay another hand on them. They'd already destroyed themselves. As he reached the hallway, he paused. "You'll live," he said over his shoulder. Then quieter, "But you'll never sleep again." And with that, he walked out into the night. For the first time since this all began, Ethan felt free. Game over. Ethan stepped out into the cold night air, inhaling deeply. The weight that had sat on his chest since the moment he walked into that bedroom was gone. Not because he'd hurt them, not because he'd sought revenge, but because he had chosen control. He could have ended them. It would have been easy. But true punishment wasn't about violence. It was about taking away what someone valued most. And for James and Eric, that was certainty. They would wake up every day wondering if today was the day Ethan decided to finish the job. Every meal, every drink, every dark alley, they would wonder. And Natalie? Whether she lived or died, it didn't matter anymore. She was already dead to him. Ethan pulled his car keys from his pocket, his fingers steady. For the first time in years, he felt clarity. Betrayal had broken him. But revenge? Revenge had set him free. As he drove off into the night, he left behind not just a house, not just a marriage, but the man he used to be. And that was the real lesson. Some people will destroy you if you let them. But if you walk away with your soul intact, you win. Every time. Thank you for being a part of this story with me. If it moved you, please give the video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Narrative Stories. I've noticed many of you who enjoy these stories aren't subscribed yet. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel, you're becoming part of a community that values deep, meaningful storytelling. Let's continue exploring these heartfelt journeys together. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story.